The air in Eden Hill, Georgia, hung thick and heavy with the promise of a sweltering summer storm. The year was 1856, a time of stark divides and unspoken truths, where the Abernathy family's word was law and their plantation, the Whisperwood, a silent empire built on the suffering of others. Elias Abernathy, a man whose face was a permanent mask of stern authority, sat on the veranda of his grand house, the rhythmic creak of his rocking chair a metronome to the oppressive silence. He watched the horizon, his gaze as unyielding as the oppressive heat. His wife, Beatrice, a woman whose beauty was fading under a veil of perpetual anxiety, wrung her hands, a nervous habit that had grown worse with each passing year. Their son, Thomas, the supposed heir to this dominion, stood nearby, his youthful arrogance a thin veneer over a deep-seated fear. Thomas was a reflection of his father's cruelty, but without the cold control. His temper was a lit fuse, and it was his recent outburst that had led to the current predicament. Samuel, a slave barely older than Thomas, had been caught trying to teach himself to read. A simple act of defiance, yet in Elias Abernathy's eyes, a heinous crime that threatened the very foundation of his power. He must be punished, Elias had declared, his voice a low rumble. A lesson not just for him, but for all of them, a lesson in their place. The punishment he devised was a grotesque parody of a sacred institution, a marriage. Samuel would be married to a goat. The idea was so absurd, so humiliating, that it was meant to break not only Samuel's spirit, but the morale of every slave on the plantation. The ceremony was scheduled for the next day, a public spectacle meant to reaffirm the Abernathys' absolute control. Night fell, bringing a brief, illusory relief from the heat. The cricket symphony began, a sound that usually soothed the soul but tonight felt like a chorus of foreboding. Thomas wandered the grounds, unable to shake the image of Samuel's face after the punishment was announced. Not fear, but a quiet, chilling defiance. It was a look that haunted him, a silent accusation that made the bourbon he was drinking taste like ash. He found himself near the slave quarters, the low murmur of voices a backdrop to his unease. He could hear them talking, their whispers a weight on the air, but he couldn't make out the words. The feeling of being watched, of being judged, was overwhelming. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit main house, Beatrice moved from room to room, adjusting a lamp here, straightening a curtain there, a flurry of pointless activity. She had not voiced her dissent, for to do so would be to invite Elias's cold fury. But the idea of the ceremony churned in her stomach, a bitter bile of shame and dread. She saw the fear in her son's eyes, the same fear she saw in her own reflection, and it was a new kind of terror. This wasn't just punishment, it was a descent into something monstrous, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would not end well. The next morning dawned with a sickly yellow light, the sky a bruised canvas of oppressive clouds. The air was still and heavy, the humidity clinging to everything. The slaves were gathered in the open field near the stables, their faces a mix of fear and quiet resolve. Samuel stood in the center, his shoulders back, his chin held high. Beside him a scrawny, terrified goat was tethered, bleating nervously. Elias, standing on a makeshift platform, began to speak, his voice booming across the silent field. He spoke of defiance and consequences, of the natural order of things, his words a pretense for the cruelty he was about to unleash. As the ceremony concluded, the air was thick with a palpable tension. The Abernathys' dominance had been asserted, but the victory felt hollow. As the crowd dispersed, a sudden blinding flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The first drops of rain fell, not as a gentle shower but as a violent downpour, the sky weeping in protest. It was a fitting end to the horrifying spectacle. As the family retreated to the house, shaken but triumphant, Thomas looked back at the field. Through the heavy rain he saw something that made his blood run cold. Samuel, still standing there, his head bowed, not in defeat, but in what looked like silent contemplation. And then, as another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, Thomas saw the goat. It was no longer tethered, and it was looking directly at the house, its eyes reflecting the light in a way that seemed almost knowing. Thomas shook his head, dismissing the thought as a trick of the light and his own frayed nerves. But a cold, creeping dread had taken root in his heart, a feeling that this was not the end, but the beginning of something truly terrible. If you enjoyed this first glimpse into the dark secrets of Eden Hill, be sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for the next chapters. There are more mysteries to unravel and more horrors waiting in the shadows. The morning after the storm, Eden Hill awoke to a world washed clean, yet a heavy, unsettling silence had replaced the usual sounds of farm life. The oppressive humidity was gone, but in its place was a crisp, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the Abernathy family. Elias, usually an early riser, found himself unable to shake a persistent cough, a dry, hacking sound that rattled in his chest. His morning coffee, a ritual he cherished, tasted bitter and metallic. Thomas, after a restless night filled with disquieting dreams, had a pounding headache. He tried to dismiss it as a hangover, but the persistent throb felt less like a consequence of alcohol and more like a warning. Beatrice, ever the picture of quiet composure, was the first to notice the strangeness. The house felt different. The usual faint smell of beeswax and polished wood was now tinged with a faint, musty odor, like damp earth and old straw. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to the previous night's heavy rain. But as she moved through the house, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck made her stop. She looked at a portrait of her late mother-in-law, a stern-faced woman who looked down upon the family from the dining room wall. The eyes of the portrait seemed to follow her, a familiar feature of such paintings. But today they seemed to hold a newfound malevolence. It was an irrational thought, one she quickly pushed away, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Outside, the slaves went about their work with a quiet efficiency that was unnerving. They moved with a purpose, but there was no chatter, no singing. It was a silent, somber ballet. Thomas, overseeing the cotton picking, noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong with you all?" he barked, his voice tight with frustration. "Get on with it, there's work to be done." But his words were met with only silent, sullen stares. He tried to find Samuel, to assert his dominance and quell his own unease, but Samuel was nowhere to be found. The overseer, a burly man named Silas, shrugged. "He's around somewhere, Mr. Thomas, keeping to himself." Later that day, the strangeness escalated. Elias's prize-winning hound, a loyal and fierce dog named Caesar, was found dead in its kennel. Its neck was broken, but there was no sign of a struggle. The kennel gate was still latched from the inside. Elias was furious, his face a mottled red. "Someone did this," he roared. But the slaves denied it, their expressions unreadable. The only witness was a young boy who, with trembling hands, pointed towards the goat pen. Elias dismissed it as the nonsense of a frightened child. But the image lingered. The goat, its dark eyes fixed on the house, seemed to be staring directly at him. The feeling of being watched intensified. Thomas, while walking the grounds, felt a presence behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. Yet the feeling persisted. A cold, silent presence that followed his every move. He began to see fleeting shadows at the edge of his vision, a flicker in the trees, a movement near the old well. He tried to convince himself it was his imagination, the result of a guilty conscience, but the cold dread that settled in his stomach told him otherwise. He started to spend his evenings locked in his room, the curtains drawn, the fear of the silent watcher overwhelming his pride. Beatrice, too, began to see things. A figure in the periphery of her vision, a glimpse of a shadow moving through the hallway. She started carrying a lantern even during the day, the weak light a futile comfort against the encroaching darkness. Her dreams were filled with a single bleating sound, a mournful cry that echoed in the vast emptiness of her subconscious. She would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound lingering in her ears. The Abernathy family's isolation began to grow. Elias's cough worsened, turning into a deep, rattling wheeze that made every breath a struggle. He grew thin and gaunt, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of its former self. He stopped going out, convinced that someone was watching him from the trees, waiting for him to step outside his protected world. The crops, a source of pride and wealth, began to rot on the vine. The cotton, once a pristine white, was now riddled with a strange black blight that no one could explain. The whispers from the town of Eden Hill began to reach the Abernathy plantation. People spoke of a curse, of a family being punished for their sins. Elias scoffed at the rumors, but he could not deny the horrifying reality of his declining health and the decay of his plantation. One evening, as the rain pattered against the window panes, he sat by the fire, a book of ledgers in his lap. He felt a chill, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked up, and for a fleeting moment, he saw it. A dark, horned shadow, its eyes two pinpricks of light, standing in the doorway of the dining room. It was gone in an instant, but the image was seared into his mind. It was the face of the goat, its knowing, silent stare. Elias closed his eyes, a shiver running down his spine. The punishment wasn't over, it was just beginning. And the fear of the silent watcher, a relentless and terrifying presence, had now become their shared reality. The days that followed were a descent into a quiet, suffocating madness for the Abernathy family. Elias, now confined to his bed, his breathing a shallow, rattling gasp, was a shadow of his former self. His once booming voice was reduced to a raspy whisper. The doctors from Eden Hill, baffled by his rapid decline, offered diagnoses of consumption and various ailments, but none of their remedies worked. Elias himself knew the truth. He was being punished, not by God, but by something far more tangible and terrifying. He spent his days staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the image of the shadow in the doorway, the knowing eyes of the goat. He started to refuse food, convinced it was poisoned, and his paranoia reached a fever pitch. Beatrice, consumed by a desperate fear for her husband, grew more frail by the day. She moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale and drawn. She tried to maintain the semblance of a normal life, but the constant feeling of dread made it impossible. The strange, musty smell that had permeated the house was now stronger, clinging to the walls and furniture like a shroud. She started to hear a faint bleating sound, not in her dreams anymore, but in the quiet moments of the day. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a mournful echo that made her heart pound in her chest. She began to notice small, unsettling details. A tiny hoof print in the dust of the hallway, a lock of straw on the floor of the dining room. Each discovery was a new, terrifying confirmation that their ordeal was not just a product of their imaginations. Thomas, haunted by the memory of the goat's stare, began to drink heavily, his youthful arrogance crumbling under the weight of his fear. He was no longer the cruel, entitled heir, but a trembling young man, a prisoner in his own home. He spent his time in the stables, away from the suffocating atmosphere of the house, trying to find solace among the horses. But even there, he wasn't safe. One evening, he was mending a bridle when he heard a rustling in the hay. He turned, his hand on a pitchfork, and saw it. The goat, its eyes dark and fathomless, was standing in a corner of the stable, watching him. It didn't bleat or move, it just stood there, a silent, menacing sentinel. Thomas screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and stumbled backward, tripping over a bucket. When he looked again, the goat was gone. The only evidence of its presence was a single perfect hoofprint in the dust near the feed trough. The town of Eden Hill was abuzz with speculation. Rumors of a curse, of a family reaping what they sowed, spread like wildfire. The slaves, once a sullen and terrified group, now moved with a sense of grim satisfaction. They said nothing, but their silence spoke volumes. They would gather in the evenings, a quiet huddle of figures in the distance, and the Abernathy family felt their watchful eyes on them. It was a silent, psychological torment, a chilling reversal of power. The mystery of the rotting crops deepened. Elias, desperate to save his fortune, ordered his men to try and salvage what they could. But every plant they touched crumbled to a black, foul-smelling dust. The well on the property, the source of all their water, was discovered to be poisoned. The water was now a murky, black liquid, and when they tasted it, it was thick and acrid. The animals on the farm, once fat and healthy, began to sicken and die. A strange, incurable blight was upon them, and the Abernathys were powerless to stop it. The psychological pressure was building to a breaking point. Elias was convinced his own slaves were poisoning him, and he started to lash out, screaming at them, accusing them of a conspiracy. His fevered mind was a labyrinth of paranoia. Beatrice, now a nervous wreck, was convinced the house itself was turning against them. The sounds of the house settling at night, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, they all sounded like footsteps, like the silent approach of an unseen tormentor. The final straw came when Elias, in a moment of lucidity, managed to whisper a single terrifying question to Beatrice. "Did you see it?" The eyes, his eyes, wide with a raw, primal fear, were fixed on her. "It's him. He's watching us. He's here." Beatrice, her own mind now frayed to its limits, could only nod. She had seen it too, a glimpse of a dark, horned figure in the shadows, a fleeting shadow in the hallway. They were not losing their minds. They were not alone. The silent watcher, the embodiment of their past cruelty, was a very real presence in their lives. The goat, or something that looked like it, was a harbinger of their doom. The punishment wasn't a sudden, violent act. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling, a psychological siege that was meticulously designed to break them. The Abernathy family, once the rulers of Eden Hill, were now the hunted, their power and their pride turning to dust in their hands. The arrival of a stranger in Eden Hill was a rare event, but the Abernathys, isolated in their self-imposed quarantine, were slow to notice. The man, who introduced himself as Arthur Finch, was a traveling botanist from Philadelphia. He was a tall, lean man, with a quiet demeanor and a sharp, observant gaze. He came to town with the stated purpose of studying the unique flora of the region, but his questions and his interest seemed to extend beyond the local plant life. He was particularly interested in the Abernathy plantation, a place he said he'd heard about from his travels, a place known for its unusual agricultural prosperity. The townsfolk, a mixture of fear and resentment in their eyes, told him to stay away. They spoke in hushed tones of a curse and dark dealings, but Arthur was not deterred. His interest was piqued by their obvious terror. Arthur rented a room in the town's small inn and began his work. He would spend his days in the fields and woods surrounding the Abernathy plantation, his notebook filled with sketches of plants and observations about the soil. But his real purpose was to observe the Abernathy family. He saw the slow decay of their once magnificent estate. He saw the black rot on the cotton plants, a blight he had never encountered in his extensive studies. He saw the sickness that had befallen the animals, a mysterious malady that left them weak and emaciated. And he saw the Abernathy family themselves. Elias, a man of legend, now a spectral figure in his window. Beatrice, a nervous, haunted woman who rarely left the house. And Thomas, a young man who looked 10 years older than he was, his face a mask of fear. One day, while walking the perimeter of the Abernathy property, Arthur saw something that confirmed his suspicions. He saw a small, makeshift shrine at the edge of the woods, a crude collection of stones and branches arranged around a withered tree stump. And on the stump, carved with a sharp object, was a drawing of a goat. It was a simple, childlike carving, yet it filled him with a sense of dread. He knew then that this was not a curse. This was something far more deliberate, far more human. Arthur, a man of science and logic, had no patience for superstition. He believed that every event, no matter how inexplicable, had a logical explanation. He saw the Abernathy family's paranoia not as a symptom of a curse, but as a reaction to something very real. He started to talk to the slaves, not with condescension, but with respect. He listened to their stories, to their whispered fears and their quiet satisfaction. He learned about the public humiliation of Samuel, the forced marriage to the goat, and the profound injustice of the act. He learned that Samuel, the married slave, had disappeared shortly after the ceremony. No one knew where he had gone. Arthur began to piece together a horrifying picture. The Abernathys, in their cruelty, had created their own tormentor. The psychological warfare, the rot, the sickness, the constant feeling of being watched. It was not the work of a supernatural entity. It was the work of a very smart, very determined individual who had a profound knowledge of the Abernathy family's vulnerabilities. He considered the possibilities. Samuel, the disappeared slave. But how could one man alone do all this? The thought seemed impossible. Arthur continued his research, his calm demeanor masking a growing sense of urgency. He spent his nights poring over his notes, trying to connect the disparate pieces of the puzzle. He noticed a pattern in the events. The death of the dog, the poisoning of the well, the rotting of the crops, they all had a certain logic to them, a precision that spoke of careful planning. This was not a random act of vengeance. It was a well-orchestrated campaign. One evening, he was in the woods near the Abernathy property, sketching a rare species of fern, when he saw a figure in the distance. It was a man, and he was holding a small brown bag. The man moved with a quiet purpose, his feet silent on the forest floor. He was walking towards the Abernathy well. Arthur, his heart pounding, followed him at a safe distance. He watched as the man, cloaked in the growing shadows, knelt beside the well, his movements precise and deliberate. He poured a dark, thick liquid from the bag into the well, and then, as silently as he had come, he vanished into the woods. Arthur, his mind reeling with the implications, knew he had to act. He had no idea who the man was, but he knew what he was doing. He knew the Abernathys were in grave danger, not from a curse, but from a calculated, chilling plot. He also knew that he couldn't just stand by and watch. He walked back to his inn, the weight of the secret pressing down on him. The Abernathy family's terror was not a result of a supernatural goat. It was the terrifying and logical consequence of their own cruelty, and Arthur Finch, the quiet botanist, had just discovered the horrifying truth. The arrival of the new doctor in Eden Hill brought a brief, fleeting moment of hope for the Abernathy family. Dr. Caldwell, a seasoned physician from a larger city, was not superstitious. He dismissed the rumors of a curse as country folk nonsense, and set about his work with a professional, no-nonsense attitude. He examined Elias, his expression grim. "His lungs are failing," he said to Beatrice, "but it's not consumption. It's an advanced case of a very strange form of pulmonary fibrosis. I've only seen it in industrial cities, caused by inhalation of certain fine dusts." The diagnosis, however, only deepened the mystery. Where would Elias have inhaled such a dust? The Abernathy plantation was a rural estate, not a factory. Dr. Caldwell, noticing Beatrice's terror, tried to offer a rational explanation. "Perhaps something in the dust of the house," he suggested. "Old carpets, mold, something of that nature." But Beatrice knew better. She had seen the fear in her husband's eyes, the silent, unshakable belief that something else was happening. Meanwhile, Thomas was spiraling into a deep depression. He had given up on finding rational explanations. He was convinced that the goat, or a manifestation of it, was following him, waiting for him to make a mistake. His drinking escalated, and his public behavior grew more erratic. He began to accuse the slaves of trying to poison him, a frantic, paranoid fear that made his father's previous rant seem mild. His relationships with the townspeople, already strained, completely broke down. They saw him as a lunatic, a man whose mind was broken by the very horrors he and his family had inflicted upon others. Arthur Finch, the botanist, had a quiet, persistent way of gaining people's trust. He had spent weeks befriending the slaves, earning their respect not with money, but with his genuine interest in their lives and their stories. One evening, he was sitting with an elderly slave named Jonah, a man whose body was broken by a lifetime of labor, but whose mind was sharp and clear. Jonah had been on the plantation longer than anyone, and he had seen the Abernathy family's cruelty grow over generations. Arthur didn't ask about a curse or a goat. He asked about the day Samuel disappeared. Jonah, his eyes fixed on the fire, began to speak in a low, raspy voice. He spoke of Samuel, a clever boy, a natural leader. He spoke of the marriage, the cruel and public act of humiliation. And then he spoke of the aftermath. That night, Jonah whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and reverence. Samuel didn't run away. He went to the old barn. Jonah explained that Samuel had been secretly working on something for months. He had been experimenting with old, rusted farm equipment, using the parts to build something. And he had been studying the natural world, reading the few books he had managed to get his hands on. He was a gifted tinkerer and a keen observer. Jonah confessed to Arthur that he had helped Samuel. They had used crushed molds from rotting grain to create a black, toxic dust. They had collected a rare, poisonous plant that grew in the swampy parts of the woods, a plant that caused severe respiratory illness and pulmonary damage when its dust was inhaled. And they had been secretly dusting the areas the Abernathy family frequented with these toxins. They had placed the dust in Elias's study, near his favorite chair, and in the air vents of the house. The black rot on the crops. It was a fast-spreading fungus they had cultivated and released. The poisoned well. They had been secretly adding a chemical agent that turned the water putrid and undrinkable. Arthur listened, his mind racing. It was a terrifying, brilliant plan, a campaign of slow, agonizing psychological warfare. It was not a supernatural curse, but a meticulously planned act of vengeance. The hoofprints and the glimpse of the goat? Jonah explained that it was a simple act of deception. Samuel had trained the goat to follow him using certain food rewards. He had used a small, sharp piece of metal to etch the hoofprint in the dust, and he had dressed in a dark, hooded cloak to create the illusion of a horned figure. It was all a calculated performance, a theatrical staging of their greatest fears. But why? Arthur asked, the word a whisper. Why all this? Jonah's eyes, filled with a profound sadness, looked at him. Because it's a punishment, he said. A punishment that Elias Abernathy himself created. He said he would marry Samuel to a beast. He took Samuel's humanity away. So Samuel became the beast. He became the one to torment them, the one to take away their peace, their wealth, and their lives. The confession was a revelation, a horrifying and beautiful masterpiece of revenge. The Abernathys had created their own monster, not in a supernatural sense, but in a very real, very human one. Samuel, the quiet, clever slave, had become the embodiment of their greatest fear. Arthur now had the full, terrifying truth. The question was, what would he do with it? The Abernathys were crumbling, their psychological state a fragile house of cards. The truth, in this case, might be more devastating than the torment itself. Armed with the horrifying truth, Arthur Finch knew he had to act. The Abernathy family, as despicable as they were were still human beings, and they were being systematically destroyed by a campaign of slow, calculated vengeance. Arthur was not a lawman, but he was a man of conscience. He had to stop this before someone was killed. He decided to confront the person behind the torment, Samuel. He went to the old barn, the place Jonah had told him about. The barn was an ancient structure, its wood groaning under the weight of time. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old hay and decay. In a far corner, hidden behind a stack of hay bales, he found it. A makeshift workshop filled with strange contraptions. There were rusted pipes, old bottles filled with mysterious liquids, and a small leather-bound notebook. He picked it up, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a journal filled with Samuel's neat, elegant handwriting. He had taught himself to read, to write, and to calculate with a chilling precision. The journal was a detailed record of his plan: the cultivation of the toxic mold, the study of the poisonous plant, the creation of the optical illusions with the cloaks and the goat. It was a testament to a brilliant mind, twisted by profound suffering. Arthur found Samuel at the edge of the woods, near the spot where he had seen him before. Samuel was a young man, but his face was etched with a quiet, terrifying resolve. His eyes, when they met Arthur's, were not the eyes of a monster, but of a man who had seen too much, who had been pushed to the very edge of his humanity. "I know what you've been doing, Samuel," Arthur said, his voice calm and steady. "I've seen the workshop. I've read your journal." Samuel did not flinch. He simply looked at him, a silent question in his eyes. "This has to stop," Arthur said. "They are dying, Samuel. You've made your point." Samuel's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "My point?" he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "My point was made the day they married me to a goat. They took my name, my dignity, my very being, and they made me into a beast. A beast is what they will have." Arthur tried to reason with him. "They are suffering, yes, but this is not justice, Samuel. This is a slow, agonizing death. You are becoming as cruel as they are." Samuel's eyes hardened. "You think I want to be this? You think I enjoy watching them suffer?" "No. But this is the only language they understand. They brought this upon themselves. They showed me my place, and I am simply occupying it." He spoke of the years of suffering, the casual cruelty, the dehumanization. He spoke of the day of the marriage, the shame that had been so profound it had broken him, and then, in its wake, had rebuilt him into a tool of vengeance. He explained how he had cultivated the toxic mold and how he used the rare, poisonous plants he found in the swamps to create the toxins that were slowly killing Elias. He had learned from books he had secretly acquired, from his keen observations of nature. He was a genius, a man whose intellectual gifts had been stifled by a system that refused to see him as human. Arthur, for the first time, felt a deep and profound empathy for Samuel. He saw a man who had been driven to the most extreme act of vengeance imaginable, a man who had lost his soul in the process. He saw the cold, empty look in Samuel's eyes, the haunted look of a man who was already gone. Arthur tried one last time to appeal to his humanity. "Samuel, you are a brilliant man. You don't have to live like this. You can leave this place, start a new life. There are places where people like you are free." Samuel simply shook his head. "There is no escape," he said. "I am the ghost they created. I am the beast they made me. I will be here until their last breath, until the Abernathy name is a whisper in the wind." Arthur realized then that there was no reasoning with him. Samuel had gone too far, crossed a line from which there was no return. He was not just a man seeking vengeance. He was a walking embodiment of it. Arthur knew that he had to go to the Abernathys and warn them, to expose the truth and hope they would act. He turned and ran back towards the plantation, the sound of the wind in the trees a frantic whisper in his ears. He was running not from Samuel, but from the horrifying logic of his revenge. The hunt was on, and Arthur was a man caught in the middle, a witness to a human horror story far more chilling than any ghost tale. Arthur Finch, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, burst into the suffocating atmosphere of the Abernathy house. He found Beatrice in the main hall, her once proud posture now a weary slump, her face a mask of profound despair. She flinched violently at his sudden appearance, her eyes wide with a fear that had become her constant companion. "Who are you?" she whispered, the words barely audible. "My name is Arthur Finch," he said, his voice urgent and strained. "I'm a botanist. I've been studying the land. I know what's happening to your family. It's not a curse. It's not a ghost. It's a man. And I know who he is." Beatrice's face crumpled in a mix of disbelief and dawning terror. "A man?" she said, the word a gasp of air. "How?" Arthur, in a rush of words, laid bare the terrifying truth. He spoke of Samuel, the slave they had so cruelly humiliated, and of his hidden brilliance. He described the meticulously planned campaign of vengeance, a cold and logical strategy of psychological warfare. He explained the toxic dust cultivated from rotting grain, the poisoned well, the black rot on the crops, and the theatrical illusions of the goat, all carefully orchestrated to prey on their deepest fears. He laid it all out, a horrifyingly logical explanation for their suffering, a reality far more chilling than any ghost story. Beatrice listened, her face draining of all color until it was ashen white. The weight of the truth settled upon her, a new and heavier burden than the fear of the supernatural. The realization that their torment was not some cosmic punishment, but a direct and human consequence of their own actions, was more terrifying than any ghost. Her husband's mysterious illness, her son's spiraling madness, her own unending dread. It was all a direct result of their cruelty. The monster they had created was not a beast from folklore, but a man they had wronged. And that knowledge was an inescapable poison in itself. "You must go to the authorities," Arthur urged, his voice filled with a desperate plea. "You must tell them what he's doing. You must get your family to a doctor, to a place where you can be safe. He's trying to kill you." Beatrice simply shook her head, tears streaming down her face, a profound sense of self-loathing etched into her features. "The authorities? They would never believe it," she said, her voice filled with a bitter irony. A slave, a man they considered an animal, outsmarting them. The shame would be too much. And what would we tell them? That we were being tormented for what we did to him. She saw now the full scope of their sin. They hadn't just mistreated a man, they had created a monster, and to admit it would be to expose their own monstrous hearts to the world. Meanwhile, Thomas, hearing the commotion, stumbled down the stairs. His paranoid mind instantly twisted Arthur's presence into a new horror. "He's with them," he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. "He's one of them. He's helping the beast." He was lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, a prisoner of his own fear, the truth now just another terrifying detail in his distorted reality. Elias, hearing the noise, let out a deep, rattling cough from his bedroom, a sound that was a chilling reminder of the poison that was slowly killing him, a death he could no longer attribute to a curse. Beatrice, looking at her son's madness and hearing her husband's death rattle, made a desperate, illogical decision born of shame and a fatal pride. She couldn't expose her family's humiliation to the world. She couldn't admit to the townsfolk that they were being tormented by a man they had branded a beast. Her pride, a poison in itself, was too strong, too ingrained to surrender to a confession. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice now cold and firm, a final wall of denial rising around her. "But you are mistaken. My family is simply ill. The rumors are just that, rumors. We will deal with this in our own way. We ask that you leave Eden Hill and never speak of this again." Arthur was stunned into a stunned silence. He had offered them the truth, a way out, and they had rejected it. They had chosen to continue their psychological torment rather than face the shame of their actions. It was a terrifying testament to the power of pride and the insidious nature of their own guilt. He realized then that Samuel's revenge was so effective because it preyed on the very sins that had created it. The Abernethys had created a monster, and they were too proud to admit they were being destroyed by it. As Arthur walked away, he looked back at the Abernethy house, a grand, imposing structure that now felt like a mausoleum. He saw Beatrice, a woman who had chosen to betray her family's safety for the sake of appearances. He saw Thomas, a man whose mind was so broken by fear that he could no longer see the truth. And he saw Elias, a man who was slowly dying, a victim of his own cruelty. He had laid bare the horrifying truth, and they had rejected it, preferring to believe in a convenient lie. They had chosen to continue to live in a world of torment, a world of their own making. The Abernethys had been defeated, not by a curse, but by their own pride and their inability to face the truth. The hunt was over, and the punishment was sealed. The days after Arthur Finch's departure were a new and more agonizing kind of torment for the Abernethy family. The veil of supernatural horror had been lifted, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of a methodical and human-led revenge. The fear of a ghost was gone, but in its place was the more personal, more insidious fear of a man they had wronged, a man who was now a silent, relentless predator. The knowledge of the truth was not a comfort, it was a new and more profound kind of hell. Beatrice, her denial slowly crumbling under the weight of the truth, was a woman on the verge of a complete breakdown. She saw the dust on the floor, the signs of decay on the crops, and she no longer saw a curse. She saw Samuel's hand in everything. She was a witness to her own family's slow, agonizing destruction, and her pride, the very thing that had made her reject Arthur's help, now felt like a lead weight dragging her down. She would walk through the house, her hands trembling, wiping away imaginary dust, convinced that every speck was another dose of the poison. She started to cook for herself and Thomas, refusing to let the slaves handle their food. Her paranoia now a rational fear, a constant, sickening ritual. Thomas, however, was lost. Arthur's words had not broken through his fear, they had only twisted it. He was now convinced that the beast was not just a symbol, but a physical being, a man-beast who was hunting them. His paranoia was no longer just a fear of a ghost. It was a physical, palpable terror of a real man who could be anywhere, watching him, waiting. He started carrying a shotgun with him everywhere, even inside the house. He would spend hours staring out the windows, his eyes wild and bloodshot, his finger on the trigger. He saw a shadow in the distance and would fire, his shots echoing through the silent, dead plantation. He was a man consumed by a fear of the living, a more terrifying and immediate fear than that of the dead, a fear that was slowly eating him alive. Elias, in his bed, was a silent testament to the efficacy of Samuel's plan. He was a husk of a man, his once powerful frame now gaunt and skeletal. His cough was a constant hacking sound, a sound of lungs slowly turning to stone. He was lucid, but his lucidity was a new kind of hell. He knew what was happening to him. He knew that the man he had wronged, the man he had tried to humiliate, was now slowly killing him. His punishment wasn't in some distant afterlife. It was here, now, in the relentless, slow unraveling of his body. He would stare out the window, his eyes filled with a raw, primal fear, the fear of a man who was completely and utterly helpless. He had lived his life believing he had absolute control, and now, in his final days, he was a witness to his own powerlessness. The town of Eden Hill, meanwhile, had begun to turn its back on the Abernethys. The rumors had solidified into a cold, hard truth. The Abernethy family was being punished, not by a curse, but by their own actions. The townsfolk would not come near the plantation. The merchants refused to extend them credit. The Abernathy name, once a symbol of power and wealth, was now a byword for shame and ruin. Their isolation was complete, a fitting end for a family that had always stood apart from the world, a world they believed they were superior to. One evening, as a cold rain began to fall, Beatrice found Thomas in the study, his face buried in his hands. He was crying, not with fear, but with a profound, soul-deep grief. "He was right, Mother," he sobbed. "Finch was right. It's him. It's Samuel. He's here. I saw him." Beatrice's heart froze in her chest. "Where?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "In the hallway," he sobbed. "I heard a sound. I looked up, and I saw him. Just for a moment. He was gone in a flash, but I know it was him. And he was holding a small bag. A bag like the one Finch said he was using." Beatrice knew what that meant. The poison was now inside the house. They were trapped. They were not only victims of their past, but prisoners of their present. The realization that they were slowly being suffocated, that their home was now a tomb, was more than she could bear. She looked at her son, his body shaking with sobs, and she saw a man who was already dead, killed not by poison, but by the weight of his own guilt and fear. She went to Elias's room, her mind made up. They had to leave. They had to confess. The price of their pride was their lives. She walked into the room, her hand on the doorknob, and she saw it. A small, dark bag lying on the floor near Elias's bed. And as she looked closer, she saw something else. A small, perfectly carved hoofprint in the dust on the floor. It was a sign, a symbol of their defeat. A final, horrifying reminder that they were being hunted, and the hunter was already inside the house. A silent, unseen presence that had finally brought them to their knees. The Abernathy family's final days were a slow-motion descent into a living nightmare. They were trapped in their grand house, a gilded cage where the very walls seemed to be closing in on them. Each ornate detail a cruel reminder of the life they had built on the backs of others. Beatrice, her hope extinguished like a snuffed candle, had given up. She no longer had the strength to perform the futile rituals of a housewife. Her days were spent in the parlor, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes vacant and fixed on the rain-streaked window. The world outside had become a canvas of her own internal desolation. The musty smell of damp earth and straw, a scent she now recognized as the scent of their tormentor, had become a permanent resident of the house, clinging to the heavy velvet curtains and seeping into the very wood of the polished floors. It was a constant, sickening reminder of the man they had wronged, a ghost in the air that never left. Thomas, his mind completely broken, spent his days and nights in a self-imposed prison, barricaded in his room. The shotgun he clutched in his hands was not a tool of defense, but a prop for his ongoing private horror show. He saw shadows in the corners of his room that danced and contorted into grotesque, horned figures. He heard footsteps in the hallway that were not there, and the faint, mournful bleating that had once been a distant torment was now a constant chorus in his mind. He would scream out, a series of frantic, terrified curses, his voice echoing through the silent halls like the cries of a man being consumed from the inside out. He was a prisoner of his own fear, a living ghost haunted by the truth. His physical body was still present, but his soul, his sanity, had long since abandoned him. He was a man-shaped void, filled only with the chilling knowledge of what he and his family had done. Elias in his bed was a silent figure, a monument to the price of cruelty. His breathing was so shallow that Beatrice would have to lean close to him to see if he was still alive. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, and in them Beatrice could see a profound, soul-deep terror. It was the fear of a man who had lost everything, his power, his wealth, his family, and was now about to lose his life, not to some grand, heroic illness, but to a slow, methodical vengeance he himself had created. He would sometimes try to speak, his lips forming a single word, a word Beatrice now knew was Samuel. It was a plea, a confession, and a final haunting admission of his guilt. The silence in the house was broken only by Elias's labored breathing, Thomas's frantic screams, and the constant maddening sound of that faint, mournful bleating that seemed to come from the deepest recesses of the house. It was a sound that had now become a part of their reality, a constant, terrifying echo of their past. It was the sound of a beast they had created, who was now stalking them in the final moments of their lives. The slaves, working in the fields, would speak of the Abernathy family in hushed tones. They spoke of the slow decay of the plantation, the madness of the son, the sickness of the father. They said nothing, but their silence and their unreadable expressions were a form of justice in themselves. They had seen the Abernathy's pride, and they were now witnessing its price. They were not gloating, they were simply observing, a silent, knowing audience to the final act of a human tragedy. One day, Beatrice was sitting in the parlor, staring out the window, when she saw a figure at the edge of the woods. It was a man, his form obscured by a dark cloak. She could not make out his features, but she saw something in his hand. It was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine, a goat. The figure simply stood there, a silent sentinel, for what felt like an eternity. He wasn't doing anything. He was just watching them. It was a new and more terrifying form of torment. He was no longer actively attacking them. He was simply waiting, a silent harbinger of their end, and the psychological weight of his presence was more devastating than any physical act of vengeance. He was a ghost in the flesh, a living embodiment of their sins, and his silent watch was the final, most terrifying punishment. That night, Elias passed away. He did not go with a bang, but with a whisper. He simply stopped breathing. Beatrice, her body shaking with a profound, terrifying numbness, went to tell Thomas. She found him in his room, his eyes wide and unblinking, the shotgun lying on the floor. He was not breathing either. He had died not from poison or a physical attack, but from a heart attack brought on by the relentless terror. The fear had finally consumed him, and he had simply ceased to be. Beatrice, the last Abernathy, was now alone. She sat in the silent, suffocating house, the weight of their family's sins a physical presence in the room. The silence was finally absolute, broken only by her own quiet sobs. She had chosen pride over life, and now she had lost everything. The torment wasn't over. It had simply changed its form. She was no longer a victim of a curse or a vengeance. She was now a prisoner of her own guilt, a final horrifying testament to the consequences of their cruelty. She had nothing left to fear from Samuel. The fear he had instilled in her was now a part of her, a permanent, suffocating burden. The morning after the final Abernathy died, the sun rose over Eden Hill, a new, clean light washing over the landscape. The rain had stopped, and the air was now fresh and clear. The townsfolk, hearing the news, came to the plantation, their expressions a mixture of morbid curiosity and silent, grim satisfaction. They found the Abernathy house as silent as a tomb, a grand, imposing monument to a family that had destroyed itself. They found Elias and Thomas dead, and Beatrice, the last of the Abernathys, a hollowed-out shell of a woman, sitting in the parlor, her eyes vacant and unseeing. The house, they all noted, smelled of something strange, a faint, lingering scent of damp earth and straw, a scent that would forever be associated with the Abernathy curse. Arthur Finch, who had stayed in Eden Hill, his conscience not allowing him to leave, was among the first to arrive. He walked through the house, a silent, grim spectator to the end of a family. He saw the shotgun on the floor, the signs of Thomas's paranoia. He saw the vacant look in Beatrice's eyes, the profound, soul-deep brokenness. And he saw the empty silence, a new kind of peace that was more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. He knew that the torment was over, but the aftermath, the legacy of their cruelty, would live on. He found the old barn and the workshop. He saw the journal, the detailed plans for a psychological war, and the contraptions that had been used to carry it out. It was a testament to a brilliant mind, a mind that had been twisted and broken by a cruel and unjust world. Arthur knew that this was not a story of a ghost or a curse. It was a story of a human being, pushed to the very edge of his humanity, who had turned his suffering into a weapon. Samuel, the man they had tried to turn into a beast, had become there a perfect instrument of their own destruction. The townsfolk, however, preferred the simpler story. They spoke of the Abernathy curse, of a family being punished for their sins by a supernatural entity, a ghost in the form of a goat. It was a story that made more sense, a story that fit into their superstitious world. It was a story that allowed them to believe in a world of cosmic justice, a world where the wicked were punished by forces beyond their control. Arthur knew the truth was far more chilling. The Abernathy family had been destroyed by a man they had made invisible, a man they had tried to strip of his humanity, a man who had used their own sins as a weapon against them. The ghost they feared was not a supernatural entity, but a living, breathing man who had become a symbol of their own monstrous cruelty. Years later, Arthur Finch, now an old man, would write about his time in Eden Hill. He would write about the Abernathy family, about their arrogance, their cruelty, and their slow, agonizing descent into madness. He would write about the brilliant, broken man named Samuel, a man who had become a ghost in the eyes of his oppressors and had used that invisibility as a weapon. He would write about the horrifying truth that the Abernathys had created their own monster, not in a supernatural sense, but in a very real, very human one. Their punishment was not a random act of fate, but the logical, chilling consequence of their own actions. The Abernathy plantation was abandoned. The grand house, once a symbol of power, now stood as a silent monument to a family that had destroyed itself. The fields, once lush with cotton, were now overgrown with weeds, and the well was still poisoned, its water a dark, foul liquid. On the rare occasions that someone would dare to venture near the property, they would say they heard a sound, a faint, mournful bleating that echoed through the silent woods, the ghost of a ghost, a terrifying reminder of a family that had chosen pride over life and had paid the ultimate price. The punishment had been delivered not by a curse, but by the relentless, logical vengeance of a man who had become the very beast they had made him. His revenge was a silent, permanent mark on the history of Eden Hill, a chilling testament to the fact that some ghosts are not in the beyond, but are born from the darkest parts of human cruelty.